Sasquatch is living on our ranch, and it's getting worse. That's not just a story title. It's what we've been living through for months on a cattle ranch in the Oregon high desert. At first, it was just little things. Fence posts, broken, cattle scattered, trail cameras going missing without a trace. But then, the signs grew bolder. 16-inch barefoot tracks in the dust, slow knocks echoing on the side of the barn in the dead of night, and a smell so strong and sour it clung to our clothes. Deputies told us it was vandals. A state biologist said maybe it was bear damage, but deep down, we knew better. Something is here, something intelligent, something pushing closer every single night. And if it really is living on our ranch, what happens when it decides we don't belong here anymore? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe. Before you leave, I've worked this land my entire life, just like my father before me. Our ranch sits in the high desert of eastern Oregon, where the sagebrush meets the pine forests at the base of the Cascade Range. It's not what most folks picture. When they think of Oregon, no rainy coastline or hipster coffee shops out here, just 2,000 acres of tough country that's been in my family since 1948, when my grandfather bought it with his savings from the war. The main house is nothing fancy, just a 2-story farmhouse built in the 1930s, white paint perpetually peeling from the harsh winters and baking summers. My wife and I raised our kids here, just like my parents raised me. The barn needs a new coat of red paint, and the workshop could use some organizing, but everything works the way it needs to. We run about 300 head of cattle, mostly Black Angus, across terrain that ranges from flat grazing land to rocky slopes that challenge even the most sure-footed stock. I quote, "I'm not what you'd call a superstitious man." 25 years of ranching teaches you to trust what you can see, measure, and fix with your own 2 hands. When a calf goes missing, it's usually a mountain lion or coyotes. When the cattle get spooked, it's typically a bear or the neighbor's dogs running loose again. Everything has a logical explanation if you look hard enough. Or at least that's what I used to believe. It started about 3 months ago, in late August. The days were still hot, but the nights were getting cooler, hinting at the fall to come. I noticed the cattle acting different, more skittish than usual, clustering together even in good grazing areas. At first, I chalked it up to predator pressure. We'd had problems with wolves moving back into the area over the past few years, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife had confirmed a new pack, establishing territory about 40 miles north of us. But something about this felt different. The cattle weren't just nervous. They were avoiding certain parts of the property altogether. Good pasture land, areas they'd grazed happily for years, suddenly stood untouched. The North Ridge, especially about 800 acres of mixed grass and woodland that usually provided some of our best late summer grazing, might as well have had an invisible fence around it. My wife noticed it too, though she didn't say much at first. She's always been the practical one, keeping the books balanced and making sure we stay on top of equipment maintenance and fence repairs. But I'd catch her standing at the kitchen window some evenings, staring out toward the ridge with a worried look I hadn't seen before. The dogs changed too. We keep 3 working dogs on the ranch, 2 border collies and an Australian shepherd, and they're usually fearless. They'll chase off coyotes twice their size and bark at anything that doesn't belong. But lately, they've been sticking close to the house after sunset. The younger collie, Max, who used to love running the fence line at dusk, now whines and paces if we try to take him out after dark. I quote, "I'm not talking about this because I expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself. Some days. But when you've worked the same piece of land for as long as I have, you develop a sense for when something's not right. It's like knowing a storm is coming before the clouds roll in. There's a feeling in the air, a change in the way things move and sound that sets your teeth on edge. Last week, I found one of our fence lines down along the North Ridge. Not broken, or cut, mind you. The whole section, about 30 feet of heavy gauge wire and 3 metal posts, had been pulled up and laid down like someone was opening a gate. Except the posts weren't bent or damaged. They'd been pulled straight up out of the rocky ground, concrete footings and all, with what must have been tremendous force. My first thought was vandals, Maybe someone with a truck and chain trying to let our cattle out for kicks. But there were no tire tracks, no tool marks, nothing to suggest how it had been done. Just those posts, laid neat as you please in the grass, and a set of impressions in the dirt that made my mouth go dry when I saw them. I quote, "I've spent my life reading signs in the dirt, tracking cattle, following game trails, spotting where predators have passed through. These weren't any tracks I'd ever seen before. They were, well, I'll get to that. First, you need to understand what this land means to us and why what's happening here matters so much. This isn't just property to us. It's our heritage, our livelihood, and our home. Whatever's going on, whatever's causing these disturbances, it's threatening everything we've built here. And it's getting worse and worse. I quote, "We worked this land my entire life, just like my father before me." Our ranch sits in the high desert of eastern Oregon, where the sagebrush meets the pine forests at the base of the Cascade Range. It's not what most folks picture when they think of Oregon. No rainy coastline or hipster coffee shops out here. Just 2,000 acres of tough country that's been in my family since 1948, when my grandfather bought it with his savings from the war. The Morrison Ranch. That's what the wooden sign at our gate still reads, though the letters are weathered now. My wife Sarah and I raise about 300 head of cattle here, along with keeping a small horse stable. It's not the biggest operation in Crook County, but it's always been enough to keep food on the table and our kids in college. At least, it was until these past few months. It started with little things. The kind of problems any rancher deals with, but there were just too many of them happening at once. I first noticed something was off back in early March when I went to check on the herd in our north pasture. The cattle were scattered in small groups across the field, which wasn't their usual behavior. Typically they stick together, especially in the colder months. I didn't think much of it that first time, just rounded them up and went about my day. But then it kept happening. Every few days, I'd find the herd split up, sometimes as far as half a mile apart. It was like something was spooking them during the night. But there were no signs of predators, no tracks from wolves or cougars, no carcasses, nothing. Just nervous cattle that were becoming harder to manage. Then came the fence posts. We've got miles of fencing to maintain, and sure, posts break now and then from weather or wear, but these were different. I found 3 posts snapped clean off at ground level along the western property line. Not rotted through or pushed over by the wind, snapped, with splinters pointing in all directions like they'd been twisted apart. I've been working with wood my whole life, and I'd never seen breaks quite like that. The missing tools were what really started to get under my skin. I'm methodical about my equipment. Have to be when you're running a ranch this size. Every tool has its place in the workshop, and I always put things back where they belong. But tools started disappearing. First, it was just a hammer from the workbench. I figured I'd left it somewhere and would find it later. Then, one of our better axes vanished from the tool shed. A week after that, a pair of heavy bolt cutters went missing. Sarah suggested, maybe we had a thief, but nothing else was ever taken. Not the expensive power tools, not the fuel cans, not even the copper, wiring that thieves usually go for. Just basic hand tools, 1 or 2 at a time, spread out over weeks. The work started piling up. With the cattle scattered more often, I was spending extra hours each day just getting them back together. The broken fence posts needed replacing, which meant more time and money we hadn't budgeted for. And having to constantly track down or replace missing tools was making every job take longer than it should. I'm not the type to let my imagination run wild. 25 years of ranching teaches you to look for practical explanations. But there was something about the pattern of it all that kept nagging at me. The cattle weren't just scattered randomly. They were always split into groups of similar sizes, like something had deliberately separated them. The fence posts weren't broken by weather or accidents. They were twisted with what had to be significant force. And the missing tools, well, they were all the kind that could be used for basic construction or demolition. I started keeping a journal of these incidents, thinking maybe I'd spot a pattern or at least have something to show the sheriff if things got worse. By mid-April, I had 3 pages of notes. Dates, times, locations of scattered cattle, descriptions of broken fence posts, and a growing list of missing tools. Looking at it all written down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something methodical was happening. Something that was slowly but surely disrupting our routine and straining our resources. Sarah noticed the change in me. "You're up earlier and earlier these days," she said one morning over coffee. "And you're the last one in at night. This isn't sustainable, Jack." She was right, of course. I was wearing myself out trying to stay ahead of these problems, checking and double-checking everything, starting my days before dawn and ending them well after dark. But what else could I do? This was our livelihood, our heritage, and something was slowly picking it apart. I was checking the fence line that evening, something I do 3 or 4 times a week. It was early October, and the sun was already getting lazy, dropping toward the horizon earlier each day. The temperature had started to dip, and I could smell winter in the air, that crisp, clean scent that always reminds me of wood smoke and frost. My old Ford pickup bumped along the eastern perimeter, following the worn dirt track I've driven thousands of times. I usually enjoy this part of the day. It's quiet, peaceful work that gives me time to think. But lately, these routine checks had been anything but routine. It started with the cattle acting strange. They'd bunch up in odd places, away from their usual grazing spots. Then we began finding fence posts broken. Not the normal wear and tear from weather and wildlife, but snapped clean through, like something had deliberately pushed them over. Tools would go missing from the workshop, only to turn up days later, in completely different places across the property. I pulled up near Thompson Creek, where the fence crosses the water. This spot always needs extra attention, because the spring floods tend to wash debris up against the wire. As I climbed out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravelly soil, something caught my eye near the creek bank. At first, I thought, it was just another pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't randomly scattered stones. Someone, or something, had stacked them deliberately. 3 large rocks balanced one on top of the other, with smaller ones arranged around the base in what looked like a pattern. The largest stone must have weighed at least 50 pounds, and it was balanced perfectly on a smaller one, defying gravity in a way that made my skin crawl. "What the hell?" I muttered, circling the formation. In all my years on this land, I'd never seen anything like it. Sure, we got the occasional hiker or hunter straying onto our property, but they usually stuck to the main trails, and they certainly didn't waste time building rock sculptures. I crouched down, examining the ground. Around the stones, the soil was dry and dusty, perfect for holding tracks, but I couldn't find a single footprint. No boot marks, no tire tracks, not even animal prints. It was as if someone had dropped these rocks from the sky. The creek gurgled quietly beside me, and a cool breeze rustled through the sagebrush. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The rational part of my mind said it had to be trespassers, maybe some bored teenagers or New Age hikers doing their meditation thing, but something about those perfectly balanced rocks and the complete absence of tracks made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures. Sarah would want to see this, and I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. The sun was getting lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As beautiful as it was, I suddenly didn't want to be out here after dark. Before heading back to the truck, I walked the fence line one last time. Everything seemed secure enough. No broken posts or loose wire in this section at least. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something else that made me pause. The cattle tracks that usually crisscrossed this area were all headed in the same direction, away from the creek, as if something had spooked the entire herd at once. I climbed back into my truck and started the engine, the familiar rumble somewhat comforting in the growing darkness. As I drove home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror at that stack of rocks, visible until I crested the next hill. I've never been one for ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. Running a ranch requires practical thinking and hard work, not flights of fancy. But those stones stayed in my mind, like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. That night, After showing Sarah the pictures, I tried to convince myself it was nothing to worry about. Just another strange occurrence to add to the growing list of oddities on the ranch. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Those perfectly balanced rocks weren't just out of place, they felt like a message. I just wasn't sure I wanted to know what it meant. I was checking the fence line that evening, something I do 3 or 4 times a week. It was early October, and the sun was already getting lazy, dropping toward the horizon earlier each day. The temperature had started to dip, and I could smell winter in the air. That crisp, clean scent that always reminds me of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The stacked stones caught my eye immediately. They weren't natural, not by any stretch. 3 rocks balanced one on top of the other, the largest about the size of a basketball at the bottom, tapering up to one no bigger than my fist. They sat right at the creek crossing, where the fence dipped down to follow the natural contour of the land. I've seen plenty of cairns in my time, usually marking trails or property lines. But this was different. The stones were balanced with a precision that seemed almost artistic, each one touching the other at just the right point to maintain stability. I dismounted from my horse, Shadow, to take a closer look. The ground around the stones was hard-packed, dirt and scattered gravel, typical for a creek crossing. But something was off. There should have been tracks, signs of whoever had stopped to stack these rocks. But the earth told no stories, no boot prints, no tire tracks, not even a scuff mark where someone might have knelt to arrange the stones. That quote S when I first noticed the smell. It hit me as the wind shifted, coming up from the creek bottom. A thick, heavy odour that made my nose wrinkle. At first I thought maybe a deer or elk had died somewhere nearby. But this was different from decay. It was more alive. Musky and wild, like wet fur and something else I couldn't place. Shadow noticed it too, his ears flicking, back and forth, nostrils flaring. I quote, "I've spent my whole life around livestock. I know what cattle smell like, what horses smell like, even what mountain lions and bears leave behind. This wasn't any of those. It was stronger, more primal somehow. The kind of smell that triggers something old in your brain. Something that tells you to pay attention. Over the next few days, that smell became a regular visitor to our ranch. It would drift in on the evening breeze, sometimes strong enough to make my wife Sarah close the windows. Other times, just a hint that made you second guess whether you'd actually smelled anything at all. Our daughter Emma, who's 12, said it reminded her of the gorilla exhibit at the Portland Zoo, but worse. The nights changed too. Anyone who's lived in cattle country knows its rhythms. The evening chorus of coyotes, the occasional hoot of an owl, the constant background music of crickets and nightbirds. But something shifted. The coyotes went quiet first. Not just quiet, silent. Where we used to hear them yipping and howling every night, now there was nothing. The silence spread like a blanket over our pastures. Even the crickets seemed subdued. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for something, anything. The kind that makes the back of your neck prickle because you know, deep down, that silence in nature usually means something's watching. Sarah noticed it first, actually. She's always been more attuned to these things than me. "Listen," she said one night as we sat on the porch after dinner. "What do you hear?" "Nothing," I replied, and that was exactly what bothered her. "Exactly," she said. "When's the last time you heard absolutely nothing out here?" She was right. Our land had never been this quiet, not in all the years I'd lived here. The stillness felt heavy, expectant, like the air before a storm. But no storm came. Just that, silence, and occasionally that smell drifting in like an unwelcome visitor. I found myself spending more time checking the fence lines, looking for signs of, well, I wasn't sure what. More stacked stones maybe, or something that would explain the smell and silence. The cattle were getting skittish too, clustering together more than usual, especially as dusk approached. They'd always done that when there were predators around, but mountain lions and wolves leave signs. Tracks, scat, kills. We weren't finding any of that. Instead, we just had this feeling. This constant nagging sensation that the pastures weren't empty anymore, even when we couldn't see anything out there. The open range that had always felt like home now felt like someone else's territory. Someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. The land didn't feel like ours anymore. I woke up early that Thursday morning, before the sun had fully crept over the eastern ridge. The air was thick with morning dew, and my boots left dark prints in the wet grass as I made my way down to check on the trail camera I'd set up last week. I'd placed it strategically near where we'd found those strange stone stacks, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was responsible for the increasingly odd happenings around the ranch. The walk down to the creek took about 20 minutes. I'd chosen to go on foot rather than take shadow, wanting to move as quietly as possible. The morning birds were just starting their chorus, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the low mooing of cattle beginning their day. As I approached the spot where I'd mounted the camera, I felt my stomach drop. The tree was there, an old Douglas fir with bark worn smooth on one side from years of cattle rubbing against it. But the camera was gone. Not just gone. The heavy-duty metal strap I'd used to secure it had been torn clean off, leaving behind twisted fragments still attached to the trunk. I ran my fingers over the warped metal, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These straps were designed to withstand bears and other wildlife. I'd used them for years without issue, but this one looked like it had been grabbed and yanked with tremendous force, leaving deep gouges in the tree bark where it had been attached. I pulled out my phone and called my wife, Sarah. "The trail cam's gone," I said when she answered, my voice tighter than I'd intended. "Someone ripped it right off the tree." "Ripped it off?" She paused, and I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the background. "Could it have been bears?" "Bears. Don't take cameras with them," I replied, scanning the ground for any signs of tracks or debris, "and they don't snap metal straps clean in half." Later that morning, I called our neighbour, Bill Henderson, to see if he'd had any similar problems. Bill's been ranching the adjacent property for 30 years, and he's about as practical a man as you'll ever meet. "Probably just thieves," he said, his voice crackling over the poor cell reception. "Had some kids try to steal one of mine last summer. They're getting bold, coming out this far." But something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. We were nearly 4 miles from the nearest public road, and the terrain wasn't exactly hiking friendly. Why would anyone trek all the way out here just to steal a $100 trail camera? And how had they found it so quickly? I hadn't told anyone outside the family about setting it up. I spent the rest of the morning searching the area, working in expanding circles from the tree. The ground was still damp from the morning dew, but I couldn't find any boot prints or tire tracks, just the usual deer trails and cattle paths, and something else that made me pause, a series of scuff marks in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged through. Sarah joined me after lunch, bringing a thermos of coffee and her own skepticism about Bill's theory. We stood there together, staring at the twisted metal strap still attached to the tree. "Look at how it's bent," she said, touching the warped metal. "That would take some serious strength. And why would thieves bother destroying the strap? They could have just unclipped it." She was right. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. The strap was industrial-grade steel, the kind used to secure heavy equipment. I'd needed tools to install it. Whatever had removed the camera hadn't bothered with tools. It had simply torn the metal apart. As we stood there discussing it, that same strange odour we'd been noticing lately drifted past on the breeze. That heavy, musky smell that reminded me of wet fur and something else I couldn't quite place. Sarah wrinkled her nose. "There it is again," she said quietly. "Bill thinks we've got a mountain lion problem, but I've never known a cat to smell like that." I nodded, looking up at the ridgeline above us. The morning fog had burned off, leaving the sky clear and blue, but somehow the canyon felt darker than usual, the shadows between the trees deeper and more pronounced. The cattle had gone quiet, and even the birds seemed to have taken their songs elsewhere. The morning chill bit through my jacket as I followed the fence line toward the creek bottom, where I'd mounted the trail camera. Something felt off right away. The cattle that usually grazed this section were nowhere in sight, though they should have been here. This was prime morning grazing ground with the sweetest grass on the whole ranch. I quickened my pace when I spotted the first signs of trouble. The earth was torn up something fierce, like someone had taken a rototiller to the ground. But this wasn't machinery. These were cattle tracks, hundreds of them, all chaotically pressed into the soft soil. The herd had stampeded through here, and recently too, probably sometime during the night. My heart started hammering as I surveyed the damage. 20 years working this land, and I knew cattle don't just spook for no reason. Mountain lions could sometimes start a panic, maybe a bear, but this was different. The tracks told a story of pure terror. These weren't animals simply running, they were fleeing for their lives. I pulled out my phone and clicked on the flashlight, sweeping it across the ground as I worked my way along the stampede path. No blood trails, thank God. But something had scattered my entire herd across half the ranch, and I needed to know what that quote S when I noticed the strange impression in a patch of caliche dust near where the fence met the creek bed. At first, I thought it was just another cattle track, but the shape was all wrong. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edge of what was unmistakably a footprint, a bare human foot, except it couldn't be human. Not at this size. My hands were shaking as I pulled the measuring tape from my pocket. I always carried one for checking fence posts and gates. Laying it carefully alongside the print, I had to double-check the numbers. 16 inches, heel to toe. The width at the ball of the foot was easily 7 inches across. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever left it was carrying serious weight. The print was fresh, the edges still crisp in the fine dust. The night's dew hadn't softened it yet, which meant this thing, whatever it was, had passed through here just hours ago, probably during the stampede. I found 4 more prints, each one perfectly spaced about 6 feet apart, heading toward the creek before disappearing into the rocky ground. I quote for tracked every animal that roams these hills. Elk, bear, mountain lion, you name it. This wasn't any of those. The stride length alone ruled out anything I'd ever encountered. A person in some kind of costume couldn't make prints this deep or move with steps this long. Besides, who would be out here in the middle of the night, barefoot, just to scatter my cattle? The rational part of my brain kept trying to find some other explanation, but there wasn't one that fit. These were bare feet. Enormous bare feet, and they'd walked right through my property like the fences weren't even there. I took photos with my phone, careful to place my own boot next to the print for scale. Then, I pulled out my pocket knife and laid it alongside one of the clearest impressions for another reference shot. The photos don't do justice to what I was seeing, but I needed some kind of documentation. I knew the rain would eventually wash these away, and I wanted proof of what I'd found, even if just for myself. Standing there in the growing morning light, I felt exposed in a way I never had before on my own land. The familiar hills and draws suddenly seemed foreign, like I was seeing them through new eyes. Something had been here, something big enough to send 100 head of cattle into blind panic. Something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. I spent the next 2 hours tracking down my scattered herd. Found most of them bunched up in the far northwest corner of the property, still, skittish and unwilling to move back to their usual grazing grounds. Can't say I blamed them. I didn't much want to linger in that creek bottom either. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind still churning over those massive footprints. Around 11:30, my son Tyler burst into my bedroom, his face pale in the darkness. He was supposed to be doing his final check on the horses before bed, a chore he'd done 100 times before without incident. "Dad," he whispered, though we were alone in the house. "You need to hear this." I pulled on my boots and followed him out to the barn. The night was unusually still. No wind, no coyotes, not even crickets. Just that heavy silence that had been hanging over the ranch lately. Tyler led me to the back of the barn where we stored hay and equipment. "I was just finishing up with the horses when I heard it," he said, his voice tight. Wait for it. We stood there in the darkness, listening. After about 30 seconds, a sharp knock echoed against the tin wall, a single deliberate impact that made the metal shudder. My hand instinctively went to the small flashlight on my belt, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Don't," he warned. "It stops if you shine a light." Another knock came, this time from slightly further down the wall. The spacing between sounds was unnaturally slow, methodical. These weren't random noises from settling metal or branches in the wind. Each knock had purpose, like someone, or something, was trying to make its presence known without revealing itself. Tyler. Quote, S.22. Rifle was propped inside the barn door where he'd left it after his chores. I watched him glance at it, but we both knew that caliber wouldn't do much good against whatever was making those sounds. The knocking continued, moving along the length of the barn wall. 3 more impacts, each precisely spaced about 15 seconds apart. "How long has this been going on?" I whispered. "Started right after I finished with the horses," Tyler said. "Maybe 10 minutes before I came to get you. It's like it was waiting for me to be alone out here." The final knock came from the corner of the barn, closer to where we stood. Then the silence returned, somehow even heavier than before. The next morning, after another sleepless night, I discovered our second trail camera had vanished, ripped clean off its mounting, just like the first one. But what really set me on edge were the livestock water troughs. Deep gouges marked the metal edges, as if something had used a tool to pry at them. These weren't the random dents of cattle pushing and shoving. These were deliberate marks, methodically, spaced. I quote, "D had enough." This was escalating beyond what I could handle alone, so I called the county sheriff's office. 2 deputies arrived about an hour later in their patrol SUV, dust billowing behind them as they drove up our access road. "Show us what you've got," the senior deputy said, adjusting his utility belt as he stepped out. His nameplate read Martinez. His partner, Deputy Collins, followed with a notepad. I led them first to the water troughs. Martinez ran his fingers along the gouges while Collins photographed them. "Looks like someone's using a pry bar," Martinez suggested, though his brow furrowed as he studied the marks more closely. "And the cameras?" Collins asked. I showed them both trees where our trail cams had been mounted. The metal straps were twisted and torn, hanging limply against the bark. Martinez examined the damage, shaking his head. "That's some force," he admitted. "But we've had reports of equipment theft in the county before." Then I took them to where I'd found the 16-inch tracks. Though partially deteriorated, the prints were still visible in the caliche dust. Both deputies crouched down to study them, their professional skepticism visibly wavering. "Those are substantial," Collins said carefully, placing his own boot next to one for scale. "We'll file this as vandalism," Martinez finally declared, straightening up. "But these tracks," he paused, choosing his words deliberately. "I can't explain those. They're too big for any local wildlife, and the stride length doesn't match a bear." I could tell they were struggling to maintain their official stance while reconciling what they were seeing. They took more photos, made their notes, but their earlier certainty had evaporated. As they prepared to leave, Martinez pulled me aside. "Look," he said quietly, "file reports if anything else happens, but—" He glanced at his partner, then back to me. "Be careful out here after dark." After the deputies left, things got worse. 2 of our spring calves disappeared without a trace. No blood, no drag marks, nothing. That's when I called the state wildlife office. They sent out Dr. Marcus, a wildlife biologist who specialized in predator behavior. He arrived in a mud-spattered state truck the next morning, clipboard and measuring tools in hand. I led him first to the water troughs, where he spent nearly 30 minutes photographing and measuring the gouges. "These marks are unusual," he said, running his fingers along one of the deep grooves. "The spacing and depth suggest a tool was used, but the angle of force is all wrong for human leverage." I watched as he took multiple measurements, his movements becoming more agitated with each reading. He kept glancing up at the height of the marks on the barn wall, then back at his notes, shaking his head. "What about the missing calves?" I asked. "Could this be bear activity?" Dr. Marcus crouched near one of the trampled areas where we'd last seen the calves. "Bears leave evidence. Scat, fur, distinctive claw marks. They're messy eaters, and they don't typically carry prey far." He stood up, brushing dirt from his khakis. "This doesn't match any bear behavior I've documented in 20 years of field research." I noticed he was carefully writing everything in his personal notebook, rather than the official state forms. When I pointed this out, he just shook his head. "Mr. Collins, I can't put any of this in my official report. These marks," he gestured at the troughs, "they show clear tool use. The bite radius on that partial print in the mud exceeds any known predator in North America. If I were to document my actual observations, I'd be laughed out of the department." He packed up his gear, his usual clinical demeanor cracking slightly. "Whatever did this, it's intelligent enough to avoid cameras and strong enough to..." He paused, looking at the torn steel cable from our trail cam. "Well, let's just say it's best I stick to documenting what I can explain." As he drove away, I noticed he'd left his business card with his personal cell number written on the back. The gesture spoke volumes about what he'd chosen not to say officially. That night, we had a family meeting around the kitchen table. My wife Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, while our son Jake sat unnaturally still, his usual teenage restlessness replaced by something more watchful. "We need to take this seriously," I said, laying out my conversation with Dr. Marshall. "Whatever's out there, it's getting bolder." We implemented changes immediately. I installed 4 industrial floodlights on the barn and house corners. The next morning, their combined 10,000 lumens turning our yard into artificial day. Sarah double-checked every window lock at sunset, and we started keeping the rifle next to our bed instead of in the gun safe. But the precautions felt hollow against the growing weight of unseen eyes. Our 3 cattle dogs, usually reliable early warning systems, began acting erratic. Buck, our oldest Australian shepherd, would stand rigid at the kitchen door, hackles raised, staring into seemingly empty darkness. The other 2 alternated, between frenzied barking and hiding under the porch, behavior I'd never seen from them before. The land itself seemed to turn against us. Paths I'd walked thousands of times felt wrong. The familiar contours of our property warped by something I couldn't name. The cottonwood grove where Jake used to play now loomed like a barrier, its shadows too deep even at midday. Our peaceful 160 acres had become a cage, with us trapped inside. One evening, while checking the generator, I caught movement at the edge of the floodlight's reach. Something massive shifted in the darkness, just beyond where the light failed. The dogs erupted into panicked barking, then fell abruptly silent. That putrid smell rolled across the yard, stronger than ever. And I heard what sounded like heavy breathing. Not animal panting, but slow, deliberate breaths. I backed slowly toward the house, my hand on the pistol I'd taken to carrying. The floodlights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Whatever had been watching withdrew, but the message was clear. Our preparations meant nothing. We weren't securing our property. We were just making ourselves easier to find in the dark. 3 days after the fence incident, the storms rolled in. Heavy clouds had been building all week, and by Thursday evening, the rain was coming down in sheets. My daughter Lisa had driven into town for supplies, insisting she'd be fine, despite the weather. I was in the kitchen when her headlights finally swept across the front windows around 9:30. But instead of hearing the familiar crunch of gravel as she pulled up to the house, the car idled at the end of our long driveway for nearly 2 minutes. When she finally parked and came inside, her face was drained of color. "Everything okay?" I asked, noting how her hands trembled as she set down her purse. "Yeah," she said too quickly. Roads were slick. Just being careful. But something was off. Lisa's usually confident movements became hesitant. She jumped at small noises and kept glancing out windows. When Sarah asked about her trip to town, she gave clipped answers and excused herself early to bed. This continued for days. Lisa took to locking her bedroom door at night, something she'd never done before. She stopped making her usual evening calls to friends and refused to drive anywhere after sunset. When we pressed her, she'd change the subject or find reasons to leave the room. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that she finally broke. We were sorting receipts at the kitchen table when a sudden thunderclap made her drop her papers. I saw tears in her eyes. "I saw something," she whispered. That night, in the storm, her voice shook as she described driving home through the rain. Just before our driveway, her headlights had swept across the drainage ditch. There, standing motionless in the downpour, was a massive figure, not human-sized, larger, much larger. It didn't move, she said, didn't react to the lights at all, just stood there, water running off it. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. She'd been afraid to tell us, worried we'd think she was imagining things. But the fear in her eyes as she recounted that night was raw and real. Whatever she'd seen in that ditch had shaken her deeply. Sarah's confession that night changed everything. The next morning, I called a family meeting in the living room. My wife sat quietly in her usual chair by the window, while our son Jake paced near the fireplace. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Sarah repeated what she'd told me, the reaction was immediate. Jake stopped pacing and leaned against the mantel, his face draining of colour. My wife reached for her cross necklace, a habit she'd developed over these past troubled months. "We need to sell," Jake said firmly, breaking the heavy silence. "This isn't about pride anymore. It's about safety." "Sell?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "This ranch has been in our family for 4 generations. Your great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. And what good is family legacy if we're not alive to pass it on?" Jake shot back. The fear in his voice was raw, unmasked. Sarah stayed quiet, but I could see her nodding slightly at Jake's words. My wife looked between us, her expression torn. She'd always been our mediator, the voice of reason, but now she seemed lost for words. "There are other ranches," Jake continued, softer now. "Other places we could start fresh, where we don't have to live in fear every time the sun goes down." The silence that followed was deafening. Each of us retreated into our own thoughts, our own fears. Meals became quiet affairs, with only the necessary words spoken. The usual evening conversations on the porch stopped entirely. Nobody wanted to be outside after dusk anymore. The divide grew deeper as days passed. Jake started researching real estate listings on his laptop, leaving them open where I could see them. Sarah threw herself into accounting work, running numbers on what the ranch might be worth. Meanwhile, I dug my heels in harder, refusing to even discuss the possibility of selling. My wife tried to bridge the gap, suggesting compromises like leasing part of the land or bringing in security systems, but her words fell into the growing void between us. The threat outside our walls had created something almost as dangerous within them. A silence that grew heavier with each passing day, threatening to tear our family apart. The morning after Sarah's confession, I found the tack room door standing open. Not just unlocked, which would have been concerning enough, but wide open, swinging slightly in the dawn breeze. I knew I'd locked it the night before. Double-checked it even, like I'd been doing with all the outbuildings these past months. Inside, nothing was stolen. But things were different. Saddles shifted on their racks, bridles hanging at odd angles. The neat row of curry combs I always kept lined up was scattered across the workbench. It wasn't the chaos of a break-in. It felt more like someone had been examining everything, studying our tools with careful curiosity. That same afternoon, Jake called me out to the north pasture. He'd been checking fence lines when he found it. A massive oak branch, easily 12 feet long, wedged between 2 posts. The branch was thrust through deliberately, not blown there by wind. What caught my attention wasn't just the placement, but the height. The branch sat nearly 9 feet off the ground, far higher than any person could comfortably reach, even with a ladder. "Look at how it's wedged in," Jake said, his voice tight. "That took strength. Real strength." He was right. The wood was forced between the posts, with enough power to splinter both ends. When I tried to shake it loose, it didn't budge an inch. The precision of it was unsettling. This wasn't random vandalism or weather damage. It felt like a message over. The next week, we found 3 more fence sections similarly marked, each with branches placed impossibly high. The pattern formed a rough triangle around our most frequently used pastures. Mother noticed it first, drawing the points on our property. "In map with trembling hands, it's marking territory," Sarah whispered, looking over Mother's shoulder at the map. It was the first time she'd spoken about any of this since her confession. "Like it's showing us where its boundaries are." I wanted to disagree, to find some rational explanation that would ease the fear in their eyes. But standing there, looking at those marks plotted out on our family's land, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being tested. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through anymore. It was settling in word spread quickly in our small ranching community. Soon neighbours started offering their own theories about what was plaguing our property. Jim Henderson, whose land bordered our north pasture, cornered me at the feed store one afternoon. "Could be squatters, you know," he said, leaning against his truck. "Lots of folks living rough these days, moving through the backcountry. Probably found themselves a nice hideout in one of your canyons." Betty Miller from the general store had her own theory. "My nephew's a deputy over in Grant County. Says they're finding more meth labs out in the wilderness. Users get paranoid, do strange things. Could explain the weird behavior you're seeing." Even Pastor Roberts, after Sunday service, suggested it might be local teenagers pulling elaborate pranks. "Young folks get bored out here," he offered, with a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes they take things too far." But none of these explanations fit what we were experiencing. Squatters don't leave 16-inch footprints or lift 100-pound fence posts 8 feet off the ground. Meth users don't carefully dismantle locked doors without breaking them or methodically rearrange tack rooms. And teenagers, no matter how bored, couldn't maintain such a calculated campaign of intimidation for months on end. When the county deputies came back for a follow-up, their skepticism was palpable. Deputy Wilson actually chuckled while examining the wedged fence posts. "Look," he said, "we understand you folks are concerned, but without concrete evidence of criminal activity, there's not much we can do. No theft, no vandalism worth reporting, no witnesses except..." He paused, glancing toward the house where Sarah watched from the window. "Except my daughter's sighting," I finished for him. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Stories get around," he said carefully. "People start seeing things, especially when they're already worried. Best thing is probably to upgrade your security system. Maybe install some better cameras." We were caught in an impossible position. Speaking up meant risking our reputation, facing ridicule from a community we'd been part of for generations. Staying quiet meant bearing this burden alone, watching our family fracture under the strain of an unseen threat that nobody else would acknowledge. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the floodlights cut through the darkness, our German shepherd Rex started his nightly chorus. His barking held a different tone these days, not aggressive or protective, but almost pleading. He'd bark at empty spaces between the trees, at shadows that shouldn't move, at things I couldn't see but could feel watching us. Jennifer joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "He's been at it for an hour now," she said quietly. "Same spot as yesterday." I nodded, tracking Rex's fixation toward the eastern fence line. The dog would bark, whine, then back away, never taking his eyes off that particular patch of darkness. Our other shepherd, Luna, had taken to hiding under the porch during these episodes. She used to be our bravest guard dog. The presence felt closer now than it had last spring when we'd first noticed the scattered cattle and broken fence posts. Each season brought it nearer to our home, as if testing how much pressure it would take to make us break. The land itself seemed to have turned against us, every acre we'd worked for generations now feeling foreign and hostile. "Maybe we should," Consider Jennifer's suggestion, I said, more to myself than to her, about listing the property. She squeezed my shoulder, but said nothing. We both knew it wasn't that simple anymore. The thing out there, whatever it was, had marked this territory. The stacked stones by the creek, the twisted metal of our trail cameras, the impossibly high fence post markers. These weren't random events. They were messages. Rex quote S barking suddenly stopped, replaced by a low whimper. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise could have been. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I realized then what had been nagging at me these past months. The choice to stay or go might no longer be ours to make. Whatever had claimed our land was patient, methodical, intelligent. It didn't need to force us out with violence. It just had to wait, ratcheting up the pressure one broken lock, one missing camera, one nighttime knock at a time. The wilderness had turned hostile, and we were the intruders now. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.